In a quiet duplex on Chase Street, West Pittston, Pennsylvania, a family once sought safety and ordinary life, only to find themselves at the centre of a series of events that would defy explanation. Doors slammed without cause, chilling cold spots lingered into empty rooms, and objects moved with a will of their own. What began as subtle disturbances escalated into terrifying encounters, drawing the attention of both believers and skeptics, and ultimately sparking one of the most controversial haunting cases in modern American history. You will step into the lives of Jack and Janet Smurl as they navigate a house that seems alive with unseen forces, tracing the footsteps of paranormal investigators, clergy and journalists who attempted to document and confront the inexplicable. From shadowed hallways to cold, silent rooms, the story reveals the extraordinary events that challenged perception, stirred national debate, and left a legacy that continues to intrigue and unsettle. The flood that led them there. In the summer of 1972, the Susquehanna River rose with a force few communities along its banks had ever witnessed. Days of relentless rain fed the swelling waterway until it spilled across towns throughout northeastern Pennsylvania, turning quiet neighborhoods into temporary lakes of brown, churning water. The disaster, triggered by the remnants of Hurricane Agnes, became one of the most destructive natural events in the state's modern history. Entire blocks disappeared beneath the flood. Homes were abandoned and thousands of residents were forced to leave behind the places where their lives had been built. Among those families were Jack Smurl and his wife Janet. The flooding struck the region with overwhelming speed, forcing residents in many areas to evacuate with little warning as streets filled and basements vanished beneath rising water. Throughout the Susquehanna Valley, bridges closed, businesses shuttered, and neighborhoods that had stood for generations were suddenly surrounded by water that seemed unwilling to recede. For many families, the damage was not limited to soaked furniture or ruined carpets. Walls absorbed contaminated floodwater, electrical systems failed, and structures that once felt permanent became unsafe to inhabit. The Smurls found themselves facing the same reality that confronted thousands of others across northeastern Pennsylvania. Their previous home had been severely damaged by the flooding that followed the storm, leaving the family with limited options and an urgent need to find somewhere else to live. Recovery across the region was slow and uneven, with repairs stretching on for months as communities struggled to rebuild roads, utilities and homes. Many displaced residents searched nearby towns for affordable housing, hoping simply to restore a sense of normal life after the chaos the river had left behind. Eventually, that search led the Smurls to a modest duplex on Chase Street in the borough of West Pittston, Pennsylvania. West Pittston stood along the western bank of the Susquehanna River, a small and tightly knit community whose history was closely tied to the coal mining industry that once dominated the region. Streets of closely spaced houses reflected the town's working-class character, where families often lived only a few doors away from relatives and neighbours they had known for decades. The duplex the Smurls moved into was typical of the area, a simple 2-unit home that allowed extended family members to live under the same roof while maintaining separate living spaces. Jack and Janet moved into one half of the house with their young daughters, while Jack's parents occupied the adjoining side of the duplex. At the time, nothing about the house suggested that it would ever become associated with the strange events that would later make its address known far beyond the quiet streets of West Pittston. It was simply a practical solution during a difficult period, offering the family stability after the disruption caused by the floods. The structure itself appeared ordinary, like many homes built in the region during the early 20th century, with narrow staircases, modest rooms, and the kind of worn familiarity that comes from decades of continuous use. For the Smurls, the move represented a chance to rebuild. Life in the duplex gradually settled into a routine that felt reassuring after the upheaval of the previous year. Jack worked to support the family, Janet cared for their children, and the presence of Jack's parents next door provided a sense of closeness that many families valued in small towns like West Pittston. Days passed in the quiet rhythms of domestic life, and the house seemed no different from countless others scattered across the borough's streets. Nothing about those early months hinted that the decision to move into that duplex would eventually attract the attention of journalists, investigators, and paranormal researchers from across the country. Yet the events that would later surround the Smurl family did not begin with dramatic apparitions or terrifying encounters. According to accounts given years later, the earliest signs were subtle and easy to dismiss, the sort of small irregularities that could easily be blamed on old plumbing, aging walls, or the ordinary noises of a house settling with time. Life in the duplex gradually settled into a routine that felt reassuring after the upheaval of the previous year. Jack worked to support the family, Janet cared for their children, and the presence of Jack's parents next door provided a sense of closeness that many families valued in small towns like West Pittston, Pennsylvania. Days passed in the quiet rhythms of domestic life, and the house seemed no different from countless others scattered across the borough's streets. At first, the duplex on Chase Street was simply another home in a river town still recovering from the devastation caused by Hurricane Agnes. But the quiet that followed the disaster would not last forever. Life inside the duplex. In the months after settling into the duplex on Chase Street, the Smurl family slowly rebuilt the sense of normal life that the devastating floods of Hurricane Agnes had abruptly taken from them. Their house offered a modest refuge with simple rooms, narrow staircases, and a quiet familiarity that reassured the family after months of displacement. Outside, the streets of West Pittston, Pennsylvania were beginning to recover from the flooding, but inside, the Smurls tried to restore the routines that had been disrupted, clinging to the small comforts of domestic life that anchored them in a time of uncertainty. Standing among rows of similar working-class homes, the duplex itself was unremarkable, a straightforward design built for practicality rather than style. Its clapboard siding had faded slightly with age, and the small front yard was bordered by a low chain-link fence. Typical of many homes in the area, it blended seamlessly into a neighbourhood shaped by decades of coal industry labour, where houses were close together, gardens small but well tended, and life had a quiet rhythm that reflected the community's enduring resilience. For the Smurls, this unassuming house symbolised a fresh start, a chance to reclaim a sense of stability and normalcy in the wake of a natural disaster. Inside the divided home, 2 generations of the family shared the building while maintaining separate living spaces, a structure that encouraged both independence and oversight. Jack and Janet occupied one side with their young daughters, while Jack's parents lived on the other, a practical arrangement that allowed the family to remain close while managing daily routines. Such arrangements were common in working-class towns during the 1970s, particularly in regions still rebuilding after disasters, where the extended family often functioned as both a support system and a buffer against social isolation. Morning routines quickly established a predictable rhythm. Jack left for work in the local community, and Janet managed the household, attending to the children and maintaining the order of the home. Laundry was done in small, practical shifts. Meals were prepared in the modest kitchen and shared with the family, and quiet evenings were often spent in conversation or in simple entertainment. The quiet presence of Jack's parents next door added reassurance, a constant reminder that family life could continue without disruption. The duplex felt like a safe, functional home, providing a sense of security that had been absent during the flood's aftermath. Beyond the front door, West Pittston moved at a pace shaped by its small-town character. Streets were lined with familiar faces, and neighbours knew one another across fences and front porches, greeting each other as though nothing extraordinary had ever occurred. The town's history, rooted in the coal mining industry and punctuated by the occasional flood, gave residents a stoic resilience, and the Smurls found comfort in the continuity of community life. Local schools, churches and businesses all bore the marks of a town accustomed to challenges, yet the sense of shared identity and mutual reliance created a backdrop of stability for families like the Smurls. Evenings inside the duplex were quiet, defined by everyday domestic sounds that emphasized the ordinariness of life. The hum of televisions, the clatter of dishes, and the faint footsteps echoing through hallways created an auditory backdrop that made the house feel lived in and familiar. On weekends, the distant voices of neighbours mingled with the occasional car on the street, underscoring the normalcy of life in a post-industrial river town. These sounds reinforced the sense of normalcy that the family so desperately sought after months of upheaval, and for a time the home appeared as stable as any other in the borough. Gradually, however, small irregularities began to attract quiet attention, subtle disturbances that seemed unremarkable at first, but carried a weight that would only become apparent with time. A door that seemed to close by itself, a shadow glimpsed out of the corner of an eye, or a faint, inexplicable sound in an otherwise silent room. These were the moments the Smurls initially dismissed as quirks of an old house. The structure was decades old, and it was not unusual for plumbing, heating, or the settling of walls to produce strange sounds. Yet, in retrospect, these small occurrences were the first signs of a tension that had begun to creep into their lives unnoticed. For a long time, those small moments passed without much concern, quietly blending into the background of a house that still seemed entirely ordinary. The first unexplainable incidents. The quiet that had settled over the Chase Street duplex began to feel fragile, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. For weeks, the Smurls had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythms of domestic life, the comforting hum of routine providing a sense of stability after the chaos of relocation. Yet in the early months of 1974, subtle disturbances began to punctuate that normality, small enough to be ignored at first but strange enough to cause hesitation. The house, decades old and built with the modest materials typical of West Pittston homes, seemed to hold secrets in its corners and creaking floorboards, the ordinary noises of an aging building taking on a peculiar weight in the quiet of early evening. A faint, sour smell sometimes lingered in the hallways, disappearing before anyone could identify its source, leaving only a lingering sense of discomfort. The family would open windows, check drains, and sniff at the kitchen and basement, attributing the odour to lingering dampness, spoiled food, or even seasonal changes in the weather. Yet, it appeared and vanished without pattern, arriving in moments of calm and retreating just as suddenly, creating a subtle but persistent unease. Even Jack's parents, typically pragmatic and calm, began commenting quietly on how the smell sometimes seemed concentrated near certain rooms, as if the house itself carried an invisible presence they could not detect. Objects seemed to shift slightly when no one was looking. Chairs nudged out of place, small items missing from counters, only to reappear hours later. At first, these occurrences were rationalized as forgetfulness or the actions of the children, who often played in the house. But as the days passed, it became increasingly difficult to attribute the movements to anyone in particular. Jack started noticing patterns he could not explain, such as books falling from shelves even in rooms where no one had been, or a cup that had been on the counter now sitting near the sink. These incidents, though small, made him increasingly conscious of every sound and movement within the house. Jack noticed the oddities first, shrugging them off as the quirks of an aging house, while Janet quietly began to sense that some of the disturbances were harder to explain. She spoke of hearing faint voices in empty rooms, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, or the inexplicable feeling of being watched when no one was near. Their daughters occasionally reported seeing shadows darting past the corners of their vision, fleeting glimpses that could be dismissed as imagination, but contributed to an ever-growing tension. The family's responses were cautious, blending skepticism with unease, unsure whether they were witnessing mechanical anomalies or something far stranger, but all felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house, as though it had begun to assert itself in quiet, deliberate ways. At night, knocking sounds echoed through their walls, rhythmic and deliberate, yet no one in the duplex claimed responsibility, and the cause remained elusive. The sounds could be heard in both units, sometimes faint, sometimes startlingly loud, reverberating through the old framework of the house. Neighbours occasionally remarked on hearing a thump or a knock when passing by, though nothing could be pinpointed, and outside the walls the streets retained their usual calm. Even the family's attempts to record or document the sounds with rudimentary tools yielded only confusion, capturing faint echoes that seemed to vanish upon closer scrutiny, leaving them with the sense that something unseen was actively observing their attempts to understand it. Beyond the walls of the Smurl home, neighbours' homes appeared untouched, routine noises and normal activity continuing, highlighting the unsettling singularity of the events inside the duplex. The contrast reinforced the family's sense that whatever was occurring was confined to their household, making the disturbances more personal and disconcerting. The town, largely recovered from the floods of Hurricane Agnes, went about daily life without incident, leaving the Smurls isolated in the experiences that had begun to intrude upon the ordinary rhythms of their home. Even familiar household activities, like preparing meals or walking the halls at night, began to carry an unspoken tension, as if the house itself was subtly testing their attention. Other small, unsettling phenomena began to emerge: lights flickering when switches were untouched, fleeting drafts in rooms with closed windows, and doors that sometimes would not latch properly for no apparent reason. These occurrences, each minor on its own, began to weave together into a pattern the family could not ignore. There was no evidence of pranksters, mechanical failure, or environmental causes, yet the incidents persisted with a regularity that defied simple explanation, eroding the sense of security the family had initially felt. Even mundane details, like the uneven creak of floorboards or the distant whistle of the heating system, seemed charged with an unusual weight that drew the family's attention repeatedly. Small, unexplainable events would soon become more persistent, hinting that the quiet life they had rebuilt was only the beginning of something far more disturbing. When the house turns hostile, the subtle disturbances that had once seemed harmless suddenly intensified, shifting from quiet oddities to events that could no longer be ignored. What had begun as minor noises, faint smells, and objects slightly out of place now escalated into disturbances that were impossible to rationalize. The Smurl family, who had once been able to attribute creaks or flickering lights to the age of the house, now found themselves confronted with the sense that the home itself had grown hostile, a living presence capable of purposeful disruption. A cabinet door flew open with a deafening crash, sending dishes scattering across the kitchen floor and startling everyone in the house. The sound reverberated through the walls and into the next room, and the children screamed at the sudden chaos. Janet dashed to check on them while Jack crouched to pick up the shattered pieces, but the sense of violation lingered far beyond the physical damage. Even ordinary household spaces no longer felt safe. The very walls seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy that had grown impossible to ignore. Jack's voice rang out as he tried to calm the children, but even his own heart raced, uncertain whether the chaos was mechanical or something far more sinister. He inspected the appliances and the old gas-powered heating system, but everything appeared in proper working order. Each banging sound or shifted object seemed to defy explanation, moving in unpredictable patterns that challenged reason. Meanwhile, Janet, holding the children close, began to feel that ordinary reassurances, doors locked, windows secured, neighbours nearby, offered no protection against what was happening inside. Light fixtures shook violently from the ceilings, and heavy objects slid across polished floors as if pushed by an unseen hand. Chairs toppled in the dining room, a small table scraped along the hardwood, and the air itself seemed charged with tension. The family attempted to document the disturbances, noting times and locations, yet each incident seemed to draw their attention, appearing elsewhere or increasing in intensity when they tried to investigate. Ordinary domestic life had been replaced with vigilance. Each movement was watched for signs of danger. Explosions of sound erupted from the walls, accompanied by thumps and bangs that seemed to move from room to room in deliberate sequence. At times, it felt as though the house had become a labyrinth designed to terrify and disorient. The noise was sudden and violent, echoing through these ceilings and floors with a force that left everyone unsettled. Even in moments of silence afterward, the family could feel a lingering tension, as though the walls themselves were waiting to act again. Janet clutched the children, trembling, while Jack attempted to track the source of each noise, only to find the disturbances shifting unpredictably and eluding explanation. Sleep became impossible, and even brief moments of rest were interrupted by rattling doors or objects striking the floor. Their awareness of every shadow, every creak grew obsessive. Daily routines, cooking, cleaning, bathing, became exercises in vigilance, as the family navigated spaces that no longer felt under their control. Outside the duplex, West Pittston remained calm, the streets empty and quiet, leaving the family to face the escalating violence entirely alone. Neighbours carried on their lives unaware of the chaos contained within the walls of the Smurl home. This contrast amplified the sense of isolation, underscoring that whatever was occurring had chosen this household specifically. Ordinary social and civic life went uninterrupted just beyond their front door, creating a tension between internal terror and external normalcy that left the family increasingly vulnerable. Even ordinary household items, the television, chairs, a clock on the wall, seemed to rebel against their placement, amplifying the impression that the house itself was hostile. Every familiar object became a source of unease, its sudden movement or altered position suggesting intentionality. The family began to speak in hushed tones about what had occurred, their conversations laced with disbelief, fear, and the creeping certainty that rational explanations were failing. Each incident reinforced a growing conviction that the home was no longer a safe environment for anyone within it. The family began to anticipate each bang and crash with mounting terror, unable to sleep or even move freely without fear of sudden, inexplicable assault. They were caught in a cycle of vigilance, exhaustion, and heightened anxiety, every moment punctuated by uncertainty. The house had become a landscape of unpredictability, where ordinary routines were shattered and familiar spaces felt treacherous. Every step, every glance carried the weight of expectation, as though the very act of moving through the rooms was an invitation for further disturbance. By dawn, it was undeniable that the force within the home had become far beyond their control, and outside help would soon be their only hope. The investigators arrive. After weeks of escalating violence, the Smurl family realised that no ordinary explanation could account for the disturbances, and professional help had become a necessity. The constant banging, object movements, and unsettling shadows had left them exhausted and fearful, with each day stretching their nerves thinner than the last. Jack and Janet were determined that the chaos inside the duplex would no longer dominate their lives, yet they approached outside help with both hope and apprehension, unsure if their experiences would be believed or dismissed. Ed Warren's presence at Chase Street carried a calm authority, his experience as a self-described demonologist and paranormal investigator evident in the deliberate way he assessed the exterior of the duplex. His eyes moved slowly over the building, noting the angles of the windows, the wear on the doors, and the overall structure, all with the precision of someone trained to notice anomalies invisible to the untrained eye. He did not speak unnecessarily, but his demeanour communicated a quiet confidence, suggesting he had encountered events of this nature before. Lorraine Warren followed closely, carrying her recorder, notebooks, and observation tools, her practiced eyes scanning the house for the smallest irregularities that might go unnoticed by others. She paused briefly at the front door, running her hand along the frame, noting the chill that seemed to radiate from the aged wood. Even in the early afternoon, the air felt heavier than usual, as though the house itself bore the weight of something unseen. Her presence offered both reassurance and an aura of intensity, signalling that this investigation would be methodical and thorough. Even before stepping inside, the Warrens remarked on the oppressive atmosphere surrounding the duplex, a subtle heaviness in the air that seemed to cling to the walls. Neighbours walking past commented on nothing outwardly unusual, yet the couple could sense the tension that the family had long described, an invisible weight pressing against the structure itself. The subtle difference between the ordinary exterior and the charged interior hinted that whatever was affecting the Smurls was confined to their home and deeply entrenched within it. Rooms were examined meticulously, doors, windows, and furniture placements noted, each irregularity catalogued as potential evidence of a force at work beyond ordinary explanation. Ed moved deliberately from room to room, assessing light sources, airflow, and sound patterns, while Lorraine recorded every observation, careful not to jump to conclusions. The duplex, modest in size, allowed for a comprehensive survey, and yet each room seemed to hold its own secrets, subtle disruptions waiting to be acknowledged and documented. The Smurls recounted incidents in detail, from faint whispers to violent impacts, while the investigators listened carefully, jotting notes and asking precise questions to clarify timing and location. Janet spoke of items falling without cause, while the children described fleeting shadows that seemed to vanish when observed directly. Jack recounted the loud noises in the walls and the sense of being watched, and each account was carefully noted, creating a chronological map of activity that would guide the investigation. Cold spots, fleeting shadows, and inexplicable noises were recorded as they occurred, with Lorraine often pausing to feel the subtle changes in temperature and atmosphere that accompanied these manifestations. At times, the investigators paused mid-step, acknowledging sensations that defied ordinary explanation. A sudden draft where windows were closed, a metallic scent that seemed to appear without source, or the impression of movement just beyond the corner of vision. These details, though subtle, reinforced the seriousness of the family's claims. Photographs, sketches, and audio recordings captured anomalies the family had previously described, providing the first tangible evidence that something beyond ordinary explanation was affecting the home. Ed carefully documented marks on the walls, furniture positions that shifted inexplicably, and the locations of the family during each recorded event. While the evidence was circumstantial, it lent credibility to the family's experiences and gave the investigators a framework for understanding the house's unusual activity. Despite their training, the Warrens noted the fear etched into every member of the household, the tension and exhaustion that had grown with each night of unrest, giving urgency to their investigation. The children were hesitant to move through the rooms, Janet often hesitated at doorways, and Jack's meticulous nature now came with a constant edge of anxiety. This human dimension, combined with the documented anomalies, painted a picture of a home deeply affected by an unseen presence. Each room explored, each shadow observed, heightened the sense that the house was far more than simply haunted. It was a stage for a presence with purpose, intent, and power. Every observation, every recording added layers to the mystery, revealing that the incidents were neither random nor fleeting but part of a broader pattern of disruption. The investigators' methodical work brought both clarity and unease, suggesting that the Smurl family was confronting something neither ordinary nor easily contained. With documentation underway and the family's fear mounting, the investigators prepared to confront forces that would soon reveal the full extent of the haunting. A claim of demonic infestation. After days of meticulous observation, the Warrens began to conclude the patterns of activity that the Smurl family could not explain. Each incident, catalogued with careful attention, painted a picture far more complex than ordinary haunting. The objects in the house did not merely move, they appeared to respond to presence, timing, and intent, suggesting that the disturbances were orchestrated rather than random. The Smurls watched with a mixture of hope and dread as the investigators pieced together the reality behind the chaos that had dominated their lives for months. Ed examined his notes carefully, cross-referencing incidents of violence, cold spots, and objects moving seemingly on their own, searching for connections that suggested intelligence behind the phenomena. Every detail, from the timing of a door slamming to the trajectory of a thrown object, was analysed for patterns. He had studied numerous cases over decades, and though each haunting was unique, certain hallmarks of malevolent attachment were beginning to emerge in the data collected from Chase Street. Repeated disturbances, doors slamming in empty rooms, unexplained thumps in the walls, and fleeting shadows at precise intervals, pointed to the presence of multiple entities rather than a single source. Lorraine noted that some of the smaller disturbances seemed playful or chaotic, while others carried an unmistakable intent to intimidate or terrify. The simultaneous existence of these varying forces suggested a hierarchy of influence, with a dominant entity exerting control over the others, shaping the environment around the family in subtle yet insistent ways. Lorraine, consulting her experience with previous cases, identified signs that one particularly malevolent force had attached itself to the family, intent on psychological and physical disruption. The entity, as she explained to Jack and Janet, was not limited to the house itself. It appeared to have formed a connection with the household, exploiting moments of vulnerability and fear. While the Warrens were careful to distinguish between unverifiable speculation and observed behaviour, the evidence suggested that this force had both intelligence and purpose, a presence that could no longer be ignored. The Smurls listened with a mixture of disbelief and terror as the investigators described the severity of the infestation, their previous anxieties now crystallising into a palpable fear of something intentional and evil. Their prior nights of restless sleep and unexplained assaults were now framed not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a concentrated spiritual attack. Even the children, who had experienced the earliest manifestations, could sense the weight of the claim, their unease heightened by the authority of the investigators and the seriousness of their findings. Sketches of object placement, audio recordings of unexplained noises, and detailed timelines of nightly disturbances were compiled to substantiate the claim, lending weight to a story that might otherwise seem impossible. The Warrens emphasized the importance of careful documentation, ensuring that every account could be traced and verified against observable patterns. In doing so, they created a methodical record that bridged the gap between subjective experience and tangible evidence, a rare convergence in cases of this nature. Cold spots lingered longer than the investigators anticipated. Shadows moved in ways inconsistent with lighting, and the subtle metallic scent that had haunted the family now seemed to permeate every room. Lorraine paused in several locations, noting the sudden chill that seemed to settle in the air even when windows were closed, and heating was operating normally. The house itself seemed to resist explanation, its atmosphere charged with an energy that was both oppressive and oddly intelligent, as if reacting to scrutiny and observation. The Warrens emphasized that the presence was not only haunting the house, but was directly targeting the Smurls, creating an environment of constant tension and unseen threat. Everyday routines, meals, homework, simple conversation had been disrupted, leaving the family in a state of continual apprehension. The distinction between the physical environment and the unseen influence had blurred, creating a persistent unease that conventional safety measures could not alleviate. Even with the investigators present, the house seemed to respond, as if aware of scrutiny, hinting that the situation would intensify unless decisive action was taken. Doors slammed, footsteps echoed in empty corridors, and fleeting shadows reminded the family and investigators alike that the forces at work were far from passive. The sense of watching and interference was unmistakable, a constant reminder that the home itself had become a stage for malevolent intent. Each observation deepened the family's sense of vulnerability, highlighting that the ordinary measures of safety and control were now rendered meaningless in the presence of such an entity. Fear, exhaustion and uncertainty combined into a tangible weight pressing on every member of the household. The Warrens' claims carried authority, yet they also underscored the severity of what the family faced, leaving no room for denial or dismissal. As the Warrens prepared to confront the malevolent force, the Smurls faced the realization that their home and their lives were entwined with a darkness that would not relent on its own. The most disturbing allegation. The tension in the Smurl household had shifted from unsettling events to a more immediate threat as the malevolent presence began to reach beyond the walls and directly touch the family. What had once been strange noises and shifting objects now carried a tangible weight, leaving the Smurls unsettled in ways that could not be explained by aging plumbing or drafty rooms. Each creak and shadow now felt purposeful, and a creeping apprehension had begun to permeate every corner of the home, turning familiar spaces into places of unease and dread. Jack Smurl later recounted an incident in which he felt an unseen force strike him with sudden force, knocking him off balance and leaving bruises that were later documented by investigators. He described the sensation as a sharp, deliberate blow, accompanied by a coldness that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. It was not a single occurrence. Jack reported multiple episodes in which he was shoved, pinned, or slapped, often in the kitchen or living room, and always when he was alone. The physicality of the attacks, paired with their unpredictable timing, left him uncertain of where or when the entity might strike next, creating a persistent state of anxiety. Janet and the children were stunned by Jack's account, unsure whether to believe what they could not see, yet the visible bruises and welts lent grim credibility to his claims. Their fear was compounded by the knowledge that these incidents were not confined to a single room or a predictable schedule. The attacks seemed to follow Jack, an invisible hand shifting with intention. The children, who had previously been cautious around the house, began to display open fear, hesitating before moving through hallways or opening doors, while Janet wrestled with the tension of trying to maintain normalcy in an environment that had become unpredictably hostile. The Warrens meticulously documented these incidents, recording testimony, marking locations of injuries, and cross-referencing events with their existing timeline of disturbances. Sketches noted the exact positions of furniture and the sequence of attacks, while audio and video recordings captured background disturbances that coincided with Jack's claims. Their methodical approach reinforced that the assaults were neither random nor fabricated, suggesting a deliberate and intelligent force at work, one that interacted with the family on a deeply personal level rather than merely haunting objects or rooms. Following the initial assault, Jack became hypervigilant, moving cautiously through the house and avoiding areas where he'd previously been struck. Everyday routines were disrupted. He avoided stairs at night, waited for others before entering certain rooms, and found himself constantly alert to any sudden movement or sound. The family's collective life became a negotiation with fear, as meals, chores, and even conversations were shadowed by the possibility of sudden unseen aggression. The home, once a place of refuge, had transformed into an unpredictable landscape of threat. The allegation became the most debated aspect of the case, drawing both skepticism and intense attention. Critics questioned whether such a claim could be verified, citing the absence of visible perpetrators, while supporters pointed to the Warrens' careful documentation as evidence of a phenomenon that defied ordinary explanation. The controversy only heightened the sense of isolation felt by the family. They were aware that their experiences were extraordinary and difficult for others to comprehend, intensifying the psychological weight of each encounter. Investigators and family alike recognized the broader implications of these physical attacks. The combination of bruises, environmental disturbances, and recurring cold spots created a consistent pattern of harassment that suggested a malevolent intelligence. The entity seemed capable of responding to human behavior, striking when the family was most vulnerable and retreating when observers were present, adding a layer of strategy and deliberation to the haunting. The Smurls were no longer merely victims of an agitated house. They were confronting a presence that appeared to single out individuals for direct assault. Whispers of the assault soon reached beyond the house, leaving the Smurls to confront the unsettling truth that their ordeal was no longer private and would draw public attention. Religious intervention. With the Smurls confronting the terrifying reality of direct attacks, the family turned to local clergy in search of protection, prayers, and guidance. The escalating violence had left them fearful of even entering certain rooms alone, and the sense that the house itself had become a predator made conventional solutions meaningless. Desperate for relief, Janet reached out to ministers and priests in West Pittston, hoping that faith might provide both a shield and a way to reclaim their home. Several priests and ministers visited the duplex, observing the atmosphere with measured attention and listening carefully to the family's accounts. They took note of the peculiar patterns that had been documented by the Warrens, including cold spots, doors that slammed without cause, and repeated disturbances that seemed to target individual family members. With solemnity, they offered blessings intended to restore a sense of safety, walking slowly through each room and invoking prayers for protection and peace. Their presence brought a tentative reassurance, but the air remained tense, as if the house itself waited silently to resist or challenge them. Daily rituals followed, becoming part of the family's routine. Holy water was sprinkled into corners, crucifixes were placed strategically throughout the home, and passages from scripture were read aloud at multiple points during the defy. The Smurls observed these actions with a mixture of hope and apprehension, eager to see tangible results, yet acutely aware that the malevolent force had already demonstrated intelligence and persistence. Even the smallest movement of furniture or creak in the floorboards now carried a charged significance, turning ordinary moments into examinations of unseen activity. During these rituals, subtle but undeniable phenomena continued to manifest. Cold spots lingered longer than usual, shadows seemed to hesitate as the clergy passed, and a faint metallic odour, previously noted by Jack and Janet, appeared intermittently in the corners of rooms. The family interpreted these occurrences with a mix of dread and fascination. They suggested the presence was aware of the prayers and perhaps attempting to assert dominance despite the rituals. For the clergy, these sensory details were corroborative, aligning with experiences reported in other cases of severe spiritual disturbance, though each haunting retained its own unpredictable character. When preliminary blessings and prayers appeared insufficient to curb the disturbances, a formal exorcism was scheduled. The ceremony followed documented procedures, conducted by clergy trained in rites of spiritual intervention, and was witnessed closely by the family. Every action, from recitations and prayers to the use of sacramental items, was deliberate, with the intent of confronting the force directly. The Smurls felt the weight of anticipation in every corner of the house. Each moment of the ritual carried the possibility of success or, conversely, provocation. Even as the prayers echoed through the hallways, unexplained noises and minor disturbances punctuated the solemnity of the event, a reminder that the entity's presence remained potent. The family's emotional experience during these interventions was intense. Fear and hope coexisted uneasily, as each member grappled with the uncertainty of whether the rituals could truly protect them. Observing the clergy perform each ritual brought relief, however tentative, but the recurring signs of unrest left them constantly aware that the home had not yet been purged of its dark influence. The children, who had grown accustomed to tension and apprehension, watched silently, occasionally flinching at the smallest sound or movement, while Janet tried to maintain a sense of calm that the house refused to allow. Some disturbances appeared to subside during these rituals, but the presence's persistence reminded the Smurls that this battle was far from over. Even in moments of apparent calm, fleeting shadows or a sudden chill indicated that the entity's influence had not been fully diminished. The family came to understand that faith alone, however potent, could not instantly resolve the complex patterns of harassment that had developed over months, and that vigilance, documentation and intervention would remain necessary. Though the clergy's intervention brought temporary relief, the Smurls would soon learn that the events in their home were drawing attention beyond their walls, threatening to expose their ordeal to a wider, curious and skeptical world. Years of fear. Even after clergy performed blessings and a formal exorcism, the Smurls found that the house's oppressive atmosphere had not entirely lifted, and fear began to settle into the rhythm of daily life. The temporary relief brought by the rituals quickly gave way to an uneasy normalcy, in which the family remained hyper-aware of every creak, whisper and shifting shadow. What had once been occasional disturbances now seemed to embed themselves into the structure of the home, making each day a careful negotiation between ordinary life and the unpredictable presence that haunted them. Objects continued to shift inexplicably, doors slammed without warning, and faint metallic odours or cold spots appeared unpredictably, suggesting the entity's persistence despite all attempts to repel it. Family members would sometimes notice chairs slightly out of place, or kitchen utensils moved from one counter to another, small acts that carried an undeniable sense of intent. Even the softest sounds, a tap at a window, the creak of a floorboard, could send a ripple of apprehension through the household, a reminder that the home's unsettling activity had not been fully addressed by prayers or exorcism. The family adjusted routines to avoid certain rooms or times of day, moving cautiously through the house, often waiting for one another to navigate spaces that seemed particularly susceptible to disturbances. Morning routines stretched longer than necessary as they checked doors, cabinets and hallways for signs of prior activity. Evening preparations were slowed by an unspoken awareness that the nights were the most active, and simple tasks like preparing meals or helping the children with homework became exercises in vigilance and restraint. Each step through the house felt calculated, every glance over a shoulder a measure against potential threats unseen. Sleep became fitful and anxious. The children were on edge even during seemingly ordinary activities, and Janet and Jack struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy while constantly anticipating the next incident. The youngest often hesitated to climb the stairs alone, and Janet would pause mid-task if a sound unsettled her, imagining disturbances where none were visible. The tension was subtle yet omnipresent, a shadow that clung to the family and coloured even the quietest moments with unease. Nights became especially fraught, with sudden noises waking the children repeatedly and leaving the parents emotionally exhausted. Investigators returned intermittently to observe the household, carefully noting that the disturbances persisted and often followed consistent patterns, underscoring the entity's deliberate and intelligent behaviour. The records documented the timing of strange noises, cold spots, and minor physical anomalies, as well as the family's accounts of fear and adaptation. These observations provided external validation that the phenomena were ongoing and structured rather than random, a pattern that weighed heavily on the Smurls' understanding of their home. Each visit reinforced the notion that the house was not merely haunted, but occupied by an entity with purpose and persistence. Over time, the family noticed that certain disturbances followed recognizable patterns. Noises at particular times, objects moving in similar ways, and cold spots concentrated in specific areas, suggesting the entity's deliberate behaviour. Some nights, Jack would awake to the sensation of being watched in the same hallway at precisely the same hour, or he would hear repeated taps near the kitchen cabinets, always in a pattern that mirrored previous occurrences. These subtle consistencies created a chilling rhythm that the family could anticipate, even as it left them powerless to intervene or prevent the occurrences. Even routine moments such as preparing meals or sitting together in the living room were overshadowed by a quiet tension. The constant anticipation of unseen movements rendering the family perpetually vigilant and wary. Ordinary interactions, laughter, conversations and chores were punctuated by pauses, glances toward doors and windows, and a pervasive sense that any activity could provoke another disturbance. The home had become a place where comfort and fear coexisted uneasily, a space where the very walls seemed to remember past events and respond to the family's movements with a latent hostility. The ongoing, relentless nature of the haunting extended across years, leaving the family trapped in a cycle of unease that influenced every choice and interaction. Each day carried the possibility of new disturbances, and even during moments of calm, the house's history of malevolent activity was a constant shadow. The family's endurance was tested not through single, dramatic events, but through the accumulation of small, persistent acts that eroded their sense of safety and blurred the line between ordinary life and continuous fear. Every creak, smell, and shadow served as a reminder that their ordeal was far from over, shaping the family's experience in ways that outsiders could scarcely comprehend. Years of persistent terror had begun to blur the line between ordinary life and the extraordinary, leaving the Smurls vulnerable to scrutiny, skepticism, and the looming gaze of a public eager to witness their story. When the story reaches the public, what began as a relentless private ordeal within the walls of the Chase Street duplex slowly began to reach beyond the home, drawing the curiosity of neighbours, local journalists, and eventually national media outlets. The Smurls had spent years negotiating their lives around disturbances, but as reports and word of the haunting spread, the events inside their home became a story with an audience. What had once been private terror now became public fascination, and the family's personal ordeal was poised to enter a wider cultural consciousness. Television crews and reporters arrived to interview the Smurls, capturing their first-hand accounts of unexplained noises, shifting objects, and cold spots that seemed to follow them from room to room. Microphones recorded Janet's soft recounting of objects moving when no one was near, while cameras documented Jack pacing hallways that he claimed were more alive at night than anyone could imagine. The early broadcasts treated the story with a mix of curiosity and incredulity, presenting the haunting as both a local oddity and a potential national spectacle, bringing the private experiences of the Smurls into homes across America. The release of The Haunted, a detailed account that chronicled the family's experiences, further cemented their story in public consciousness. The book combined personal testimony with investigators' notes and vividly detailed the ongoing disturbances, including the inexplicable cold spots, doors that slammed without cause, and objects that moved on their own. By documenting the events in print, the story reached an audience that television alone could not, offering readers a more complete and structured account of what the Smurls and their visitors had observed. For Jack and Janet, this intrusion into their private lives added a new layer of tension. Cameras, microphones, and interviewers demanded their attention, forcing them to recount terrifying moments repeatedly. Each retelling was a reminder that the disturbances continued, that the entity's presence remained unyielding, and that the eyes of the nation were now focused on a home where ordinary life had long since been overshadowed by fear. The family struggled to maintain composure, aware that every gesture, every hesitated word, and every expression would be scrutinized, dissected, and questioned by viewers and readers alike. Across newspapers, talk shows, and late-night discussions, critics questioned the veracity of the Smurls' claims, and skeptics suggested psychological explanations, misperceptions, or outright fabrication. Meanwhile, paranormal enthusiasts examined each detail, every reported noise and cold spot, as potential evidence of supernatural activity. Heated debates ensued over whether the phenomena could truly be attributed to demonic forces, or whether the story was simply a sensationalized account designed to entertain a public eager for the mysterious and unexplainable. The case became emblematic of a growing national fascination with the paranormal. The Smurls were now figures in a broader dialogue about the unknown, where ordinary people, researchers and journalists alike speculated about the presence within their home. The story blurred the line between fact and legend, and Chase Street became a symbol for the possibility of forces beyond comprehension existing in familiar domestic spaces. It was no longer merely a family's ordeal, it had become a touchstone for cultural curiosity about what lurks unseen in the ordinary world. Despite the scrutiny, the activity within the home continued. Doors slammed at odd intervals, footsteps echoed along empty hallways, and objects moved as if guided by unseen hands. The media coverage and public fascination did nothing to diminish the presence that had shadowed the Smurls for years. If anything, it emphasized the contrast between the controlled narratives on television and in print, and the uncontrollable reality inside the duplex. Even as cameras rolled and notebooks recorded every claim, the house itself retained the autonomy of its disturbances, a silent testament to the unrelenting force the family had endured. As coverage intensified, it became clear that the story's next chapter would involve more than public curiosity. The Smurls' experiences, now amplified for national audiences, created pressure from believers, skeptics, and investigators alike. The haunting had escaped the private confines of their home and entered a larger arena where scrutiny, disbelief, and fascination would collide, forcing the family and those involved to confront consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the duplex. The Smurls' ordeal had left the private confines of their home and entered the public arena, where scrutiny, disbelief, and fascination would collide in ways that would forever shape the legend of Chase Street. The skeptics speak. The Smurls' story had captured the nation's attention, but curiosity quickly gave way to skepticism as critics and observers began to challenge the truth of their experiences. What had once been a private nightmare now became a subject of intense public debate, and the family found themselves at the centre of a storm that questioned not only the events inside their home, but the credibility of every person who had investigated them. Media exposure had opened the doors to scrutiny, and with it came voices determined to find rational explanations for what the Smurls insisted was anything but ordinary. Journalists and commentators published critical accounts, portraying the haunting as a sensational tale, or, in some cases, a potential fabrication designed to attract attention. Articles recounted the family's claims of objects moving on their own, doors slamming, and cold spots that seemed to follow them through the home. But the underlying message in these pieces was one of doubt. Reporters questioned whether the events were real or simply misinterpretations, offering readers a lens of skepticism over the Smurls' narrative and inviting debate about what constituted credible evidence. Psychologists, engineers, and other experts proposed alternative explanations, grounding their arguments in scientific reasoning. Structural settling, drafts, plumbing vibrations, and ordinary mechanical noises were cited as potential sources of the disturbances. Some mental health professionals suggested that prolonged stress, anxiety, and the fear of living in a home with a reputation for haunting could amplify ordinary occurrences, creating a cycle where perception and expectation intensified the experience of the unknown. These explanations, offered in print and on air, encouraged the public to consider the events as explainable phenomena rather than evidence of a supernatural presence. Even among paranormal investigators, doubt was not uncommon. A few experts scrutinized the methods used by Ed and Lorraine Warren, questioning the rigor of their documentation and whether personal bias or a desire for sensationalism might have shaped their interpretations. Some suggested that the family's fear and the investigators' own expectations could have contributed to an exaggerated sense of menace, blurring the line between what was real and what was imagined. These critiques circulated alongside the more enthusiastic accounts, creating a tension between belief and disbelief in the public sphere. Letters to newspapers, opinion pieces, and discussions on television talk shows revealed a divided audience. Some viewers and readers were enthralled by the possibility of a supernatural presence, citing the detailed accounts in The Haunted as compelling evidence. Others dismissed the story as media hype, a modern morality tale, or the product of collective hysteria. This clash of opinions amplified the scrutiny on the Smurls, transforming their home into a stage where both belief and incredulity could collide, and where every new report was weighed against skepticism. Living under such scrutiny was disorienting for Jack and Janet Smurl. Each interview, article, or broadcast forced them to relive moments of terror they had hoped to leave behind. The media's relentless attention added a second layer of intrusion to their daily lives, compounding the fear already caused by the unexplained activity inside the house. They had long struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy, and the constant spotlight intensified the emotional strain, making every creak of a floorboard or slam of a door feel like evidence being tested before an audience of millions. Although criticised, the house continued to act in ways that baffled the family. Objects shifted mysteriously, Loud bangs echoed through empty rooms, and sudden temperature drops left the household unsettled. These persistent occurrences underscored the Smurl's insistence that the events were real and unrelenting, serving as a silent counterpoint to every skeptical argument published or broadcast. The activity refused to conform to rational expectations, sustaining a sense of unease that even the harshest critics could not fully dismiss. Increasing division between public disbelief and private terror created an uneasy anticipation that the story's next chapter would demand a confrontation or reveal even more unsettling developments. As journalists wrote, skeptics debated, and investigators analysed, the house itself remained untouched by human reasoning, continuing to assert a presence that defied explanation. The collision of belief and doubt had elevated the haunting from a local curiosity to a national phenomenon, while leaving the Smurls suspended between scrutiny and survival. Widespread doubt and debate could not diminish the shadows that lingered in the Smurls' home, leaving the boundary between disbelief and undeniable terror perilously thin, as if the true nature of Chase Street had yet to reveal itself. The house and its legacy. Once the Smurl family had departed the West Pittston duplex, the house itself became a symbol of lingering mystery, its walls carrying the echoes of the terrors that had once overtaken the family. What had been the site of intense fear and alleged demonic activity was no longer a home filled with a daily life, yet its story refused to fade. For decades, the structure remained tied to one of the most debated hauntings in American history, a location whose reputation grew alongside the curiosity and incredulity of those who studied it. Books, documentaries, and news articles ensured that the story of Chase Street remained in public consciousness, drawing attention from audiences far beyond Pennsylvania. The Haunted, along with other journalistic accounts, detailed the events inside the house, the investigations, and the claims made by both the family and paranormal experts. Television programs revisited the story, reconstructing events with interviews and dramatizations, while historians of the paranormal referenced the Smurl case as a notable example of alleged demonic infestation. The duplex became more than a home, it became a subject for discussion, speculation, and cautionary fascination. Paranormal investigators continued to cite the house as a case study, examining the methods of documentation used by Ed and Lorraine Warren and noting the challenges inherent in proving the presence of malevolent forces. Field notes, photographs, and audio recordings were analysed and debated, often scrutinised by both believers and skeptics alike. The home's role as a teaching example for investigators highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between psychological phenomena, environmental explanations, and the possibility of something beyond ordinary perception. Supporters of the haunting maintained that the experiences were genuine and persistent. They pointed to the multiple accounts from family members, the recorded evidence of objects moving, unexplained sounds, and temperature fluctuations, arguing that the phenomena could not be dismissed as a coincidence or fabrication. For them, the Smurl home represented a tangible encounter with forces that resisted explanation, a location where the extraordinary had seemingly intruded on ordinary life with profound and lasting effect. At the same time, skeptics continued to offer alternative explanations, challenging the credibility of both the family and the investigators. Critics suggested that structural settling, plumbing noises, or drafts could account for many of the reported disturbances, and that psychological stress could amplify ordinary events into perceived threats. Others questioned the methodology of paranormal documentation, noting potential biases and the influence of media attention on shaping perceptions. These disputes created a persistent tension in the narrative surrounding the house, one in which belief and doubt were perpetually entangled. The cultural and psychological impact of the case extended beyond the home itself. For the public, the Smurl story reinforced enduring fascination with hauntings, demonology, and the possibility of the supernatural in everyday life. Paranormal enthusiasts studied the case as a reference point, while journalists and academics analysed it as a demonstration of how fear and storytelling intersect with media representation. The home, though empty of its original inhabitants, had achieved a presence in the collective imagination that continued to inspire, unsettle, and provoke debate. Even decades after the events first occurred, the house's story remained unresolved. No definitive explanation had emerged, and each retelling raised fresh questions about the authenticity, causes, and meaning of the reported phenomena. Scholars, paranormal investigators, and casual observers alike continue to revisit the case, ensuring that the Smurl home retained its status as a locus of intrigue and controversy. Its reputation as a haunted location had been cemented, but the truth behind its mysteries remained elusive, inviting curiosity as much as skepticism. The West Pittston duplex remains a silent witness to a story that refuses to be resolved, its legacy lingering in the shadowed spaces between belief and doubt, where the boundary of the unknown still captivates and unsettles.